prepare yourselves to uncover the darkest secrets that history books try to hide. The name Henry VIII evokes images of a powerful and imposing king. But the truth behind his final days is a nightmare of physical decay, paranoid madness, and absolute cruelty that few dare to detail. Imagine a body that was the very embodiment of power, now ravaged by festering wounds, so immobile that he had to be moved from room to room with a crane. A sovereign who signed death sentences on a whim, while his kingdom trembled at his unpredictability. The most controversial points are the key to this story. The accusation that he ordered the execution of the young Catherine Howard for adultery without concrete proof. The possibility that he suffered from a rare syndrome that transformed not only his body, but also his mind into a monster of tyranny. And the enduring suspicion that his own wife, Catherine Parr, narrowly escaped the same fury that killed two of his predecessors, living under the constant threat of the executioner's blade. What surprised me most, in an honorable way, was not just his physical transformation, but the depth of his isolation at the end. Betrayed by his own body, feared by his family, and surrounded by courtiers already plotting the next reign while he still breathed. But the final revelation of this story, which I save for the last minutes of this video, is something that genuinely impacted me. A piece of this macabre puzzle that contextualizes his entire legend and shows the true cost of absolute power. That's why I ask you to watch until the end. The reward will be worth it. And if this journey into the dark backstage of the English monarchy has captivated you, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This subscription isn't just a gesture of support. It's crucial for YouTube's algorithm to understand that you value this kind of deep content, allowing these videos to reach more people who, like you, seek stories beyond mere historical facts. Your subscription is what ensures we can continue bringing these forgotten accounts to light. Henry Tudor, born on June 28, 1491, was the second son of Henry VII, the first Tudor king. Initially, he was not destined for the throne. That position was meant for his older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. While Arthur was being educated to govern, Henry received a Renaissance education intended for a high-ranking church dignitary. Theology, music, classical languages, sports, and sciences. This upbringing created a man of sharp intellect, but also instilled in him a deep conviction of his own intellectual and moral worth. The sudden death of Arthur in 1502, followed by the death of his mother, Elizabeth of York, cast a shadow over the young Henry. He became heir at the age of 11, and his father's obsession with the security of the dynasty led to an extremely controlled and protected adolescence. This contrast between a humanist education and a life under strict supervision, combined with the trauma of mortality within the royal family, forged an individual who equally appreciated the beauty of the arts and the brutality of absolute power. NCE upon a time, in the early years of the 16th century, there was a second son who breathed the heavy air of a still young court, a dynasty forged on the battlefield of Bosworth, where his father, Henry VII, a shrewd survivor of bloody civil wars, had seized the crown from a dead king. This boy, baptized Henry in honor of the father he so admired and secretly wished to surpass, was not born under the immediate burden of the throne. That destiny belonged to his older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, the precious jewel of the Tudor crown. The living hope of consolidating a name that still fluttered precariously in the winds of conspiracy. While Arthur was molded from the cradle for governance, burdened with treaties and matrimonial alliances, such as his early marriage to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, the young Henry was guided along a different, yet equally magnificent path, that of a Renaissance prince. His world of education was meticulously crafted to prepare him as a great ecclesiastical aristocrat or a powerful duke, not a sovereign. This crucial distinction allowed him an education that was, in itself, a garden of intellectual and physical pleasures, far from the arid shadow of direct power. Under the guidance of eminent scholars, he immersed himself in Latin and Greek classics, mastering not only the languages but also the rhetoric of Cicero, the philosophy of Aristotle, and the history of Thucydides. Theology was taught to him in depth, nurturing a mind later deemed capable of challenging the Pope himself on doctrinal matters. Music became his passion. He was a talented performer on the lute and harpsichord, and a composer of remarkable skill, whose songs, such as Pastime with Good Company, echoed the joy of a free spirit. In the arts of war and the body, he was equally exceptional. A deadly accurate archer, a knight who mastered the fury of jousting, an enthusiastic tennis player, and a graceful dancer, whose physical energy and vigor were legendary. This splendid and relatively carefree upbringing forged in him a colossal self-esteem, an unwavering belief in his intellectual, artistic, and physical worth. He was, for all intents and purposes, the Golden Prince, the living embodiment of the humanist ideal, admired by Erasmus of Rotterdam and all who witnessed his splendor. Yet death, the great equalizer of the medieval era, wove the darkest threads into the tapestry of his youth. The sudden passing of Arthur in 1502 was not just a family tragedy. It was a dynastic earthquake that brutally ripped Henry from his golden world and thrust him into the center of a stage for which he had not been psychologically prepared. Immediate pressure fell upon him as heir. But this pressure was exerted oppressively by a father who had become deeply paranoid after the death of the beloved Queen Elizabeth of York. Henry VII, once a calculating ruler, had turned into a somber miser, obsessed with hoarding treasures and exercising absolute control over the only remaining male heir. The teenage Henry was kept under near-prison-like surveillance, forbidden from participating in tournaments or any activity that might endanger his life, confined to his chambers where his only freedom was intellectual. This confinement was torture for a young man of athletic build and vibrant spirit. He saw the world through gilded bars, observing the workings of his father's court, a court of frugality and suspicion, where the joys of his childhood seemed like a distant memory. It was during these long years of relative seclusion that his royal ego, forged in humanist education, began to be tempered by a deep resentment of paternal control and a burning desire to break free, to prove himself not only as an intellectual or athlete, but as a warrior and magnanimous ruler, the direct opposite of the father who kept him captive. He dreamed of military glory, of the deeds of his ancestor Henry V, and nurtured a simultaneous inferiority and superiority complex. Inferior for being the second son, the dynasty's plan B. Superior because he believed deep down that he possessed an innate greatness initially denied by fate, but now owed to him. When his father's death in 1509 finally opened the doors of the cage, the Golden Prince emerged not as an inexperienced youth, but as a force of nature long contained, eager to expend his immense accumulated energy, to celebrate life, power, and himself with an intensity that would define his entire reign. His first act, almost symbolic, was the arrest of the two men most associated with his father's financial tyranny, Empson and Dudley, an act that was both a cry of freedom for the kingdom and a declaration that a new sun had risen over England. And so, the child raised in the shadows, educated in the light of knowledge, but imprisoned by paternal distrust, ascended the throne with a dangerous conviction that the world was his by divine and personal right, and that his will, forged in that unique contrast of splendor and confinement, was the supreme law. Behold, the death of King Henry VII, that shrewd weaver of fortunes and guardian of a treasure, opened the gates of heaven for England. For on the day of his ascension, the young Henry, once confined and watched, emerged like a phoenix with golden feathers, a knight from the old romances that the court had longed for. His coronation was not merely a succession, but a feast for the senses, a vibrant repudiation of paternal austerity. The halls of Westminster echoed with music, carpets were strewn with rose petals, and the very air was heavy with the scent of spiced wine and roasted meat. A declaration that a new sun had risen over the kingdom. And at the center of this splendor stood the king himself, 18 years old, a colossus of health and beauty, with copper-colored hair and a robust complexion, clad in gold brocades and jewels that sparkled like fire. Not as a steward of the treasury, but as a prince of legend, a new Arthur ascending the throne of Camelot. His first royal act, laden with symbolism, was to order the imprisonment of Empson and Dudley, the despised tax collectors of his father, a gesture that made the people cheer with joy, understanding that the yoke of financial oppression was broken, replaced by the open and generous hand of a sovereign who understood glory as the highest virtue. It was in this atmosphere of euphoria that he, almost immediately, made the decision that would change his destiny and that of the kingdom: to marry his brother's widow, the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. This union, which to modern eyes might seem a mere political arrangement, was, in the context of the time, an act of deep chivalry and dynastic pragmatism. Catherine, left in shadow and poverty after Arthur's death, was a living reminder of a fragile alliance and an unpaid dowry. By marrying her, Henry not only stabilized the bond with powerful Spain of the Catholic monarchs, but also rescued a princess from a precarious situation, fulfilling the ideal of the knight who protects a damsel in distress. The papal dispensation, necessary to remove the impediment of affinity from having been his brother's wife, was obtained on the solemn affirmation of Catherine herself that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, a vow that cleared her soul and paved the way to the altar. The early years of this marriage were the materialization of a dream of courtesy and genuine affection. Henry showed proud affection for his queen, a woman of keen intelligence, deep piety, and a dignity that made her the perfect embodiment of a sovereign. She was, in every respect, his companion, and when war called him to France, Henry, eager to emulate the deeds of Henry V, did not hesitate to leave her as regent of the kingdom. It was here that Catherine's strength of character shone with its own fire. When the King of Scotland, James IV, allied with the French, invaded northern England, it was the Queen pregnant who commanded the nation, sending armies and praying for victory. The news of the overwhelming English triumph at the Battle of Flodden Field, where the Scottish king himself fell dead, marked the height of their joint power. Henry in France, a knight in search of glory, and Catherine in England, a wise and fearless ruler. Yet behind this facade of power and unity, a shadow began to lengthen, slowly and inexorably. The curse that had hung over Catherine's marriage to Arthur seemed to have transferred to her union with Henry. The children, the long-awaited male heirs who would secure the fragile Tudor dynasty, failed to survive. Pregnancy after pregnancy ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or the early death of the infant. Only one child survived the perils of childhood, a daughter, Princess Mary, for a court and kingdom still living in the recent memory of the Wars of the Roses. A bloody struggle fueled by the lack of a clear heir. The presence of only a daughter was a harbinger of chaos. Thus began the great matter of the marriage, not as a mere whim, but as a theological and personal torment consuming the king. Gradually, Henry's mind, so well trained in theology, began to be haunted by a specific passage from the book of Leviticus. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is impurity. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall have no children. The words echoed in his conscience like a divine verdict. What had appeared as an act of chivalry and dynastic duty transformed, in his eyes, into a mortal sin, punished by God himself through the deaths of his children. His certainty was absolute. His marriage was invalid in the eyes of heaven. The woman he had once revered as queen and companion became, in his perception, the sister whom God's law forbade him to possess. The passion he felt cooled, replaced by religious anguish and political urgency. The arrival at the queen's court of a lady-in-waiting with a lively spirit and penetrating gaze and Bullen ignited a new flame, an overwhelming passion inseparably intertwined with his crisis of conscience. And, educated in the courts of France and endowed with a charm that combined learning and hauteur, refused to be merely a mistress, as many before her had been. She demanded the throne, and so the night, once a defender of the Catholic faith, found himself forced to fight his greatest battle, not against a French king or a Scottish army, but against the Pope himself. The great matter of the marriage became a duel of wills between Henry and Clement VII, a pontiff entangled in the political webs of Catherine's nephew, the all-powerful Emperor Charles V. The Pope's refusal to annul the marriage, dragging the process out for years, was interpreted by Henry not as a political maneuver, but as an affront to his conscience and to his power as king by the grace of God. It was this volatile mix of personal desire, religious anguish, and fury at being challenged that led the knight to commit the most radical act, breaking the sword of loyalty to Rome and forging a new one. The Act of Supremacy of 1534 was not merely a parliamentary document. It was the coup de grace of the frustrated husband and absolutist king, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. The knight who had once defended the Catholic faith against Martin Luther, earning the Pope's title of Defender of the Faith, had become the architect of a new church, all to resolve the great matter that had begun with the death of a brother and the need for an heir. The marriage to Catherine was declared null. She was removed from court and confined, and Anne Boleyn crowned queen. The chivalrous husband had become a relentless one, and the path to the tyrant of the later years was thus paved with the good intentions of a troubled conscience and the fire of a forbidden passion. The time had come when the son of Henry's youth, once so golden and vigorous, began to hide behind dark clouds of suspicion and bodily torment. A time when the scepter of power intertwined with the executioner's blade, and royal will, once devoted to poetry and sport, would transform into an instrument of fearsome and unpredictable caprice. The spiral of paranoia was not a gentle decline, but a dizzying fall fueled by physical pain, dynastic frustration, and the overwhelming weight of absolute power that no mortal is prepared to bear. The visceral turning point, beyond the anxieties of succession, occurred at a tournament in Greenwich in 1536, when the king, in the full strength of his 45 years, suffered a catastrophic fall from his armor, trapped beneath the weight of his horse. An accident that left him unconscious for hours and which scholars today suspect caused a traumatic brain injury, forever altering his temperament, exacerbating his impulsivity, and opening the doors to a suspicion that would henceforth color all his acts with the hue of betrayal. It was in this new twilight of his soul that the drama of his subsequent marriages unfolded. A macabre sequence where the monarch's motto seemed to be attachment or axe. Jane Seymour, the third queen, appeared as a refuge of docility after the storm of Anne Boleyn, fulfilling her divine destiny by giving birth to the long-awaited male heir, Prince Edward, a birth that was celebrated throughout the kingdom. Yet Jane's life would end days later from puerperal fever, leaving the king genuinely devastated. Now not just a widower, but the father of the dynasty's future. A responsibility that deepened his obsession with the security and legitimacy of his bloodline. The need for new alliances and to secure the succession led him into a political marriage with Anne of Cleves, a union based on a misleading portrait painted by Master Holbein and the flattery of self-interested courtiers. When the king, whose body was already beginning to fail and deform, met the bride, his disappointment was so profound that he called her a Flemish mare. And the marriage, never consummated, was dissolved with almost humiliating swiftness. Yet Anne, wiser than those before her, accepted the annulment gracefully, receiving in return the title sister of the king and a generous income, thus saving her own head through prudence. This rejection, however, deeply wounded the king's pride, already shaken by his own incipient impotence, and drove him into the dangerous arms of Catherine Howard, a young, effusive, and foolish maiden, niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk, who saw her as a pawn to increase his influence. The king's passion, now a sick and aging man for a girl in the prime of her youth, was pathetic and possessive. He called her his rose without thorns, willfully blind to her indiscreet past and ongoing flirtations at court. When evidence of her frivolous behavior before the marriage, and worse, her alleged adultery with the courtier Thomas Culpeper, reached the king's ears through the political enemies of Catherine's uncle, his reaction was not mere rage but deep, self-pitying despair. His declaration that the girl never had her own will was a mixture of disgust and justification for the revenge that would follow. Catherine Howard's execution was particularly horrifying. Terrified, she had to be dragged to the scaffold, and her death symbolized the moment when royal paranoia became indiscriminate. It was no longer just political betrayal but intimate betrayal, feeding his conviction that he was surrounded by lies and sin. It was in this climate of terror that the law of error, a sinister parliamentary decree, granted the king the power to define what constituted treason by royal proclamation, a legal instrument that transformed mere displeasure into a capital crime. The spiral accelerated. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the marriage to Anne of Cleves, and once the most powerful man in the kingdom after the king, was sent to the scaffold on charges of heresy and treason, his fall orchestrated by rivals who exploited the king's anger. Even Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, a learned and pious woman, was on the brink of ruin for daring to discuss theology with her husband, a debate that the king, in his wounded theological arrogance, interpreted as a challenge to his authority as supreme head of the church. A warrant was issued against her, and only the timely intervention of an allied courtier, combined with the queen's humble submission, claiming that she debated merely to distract the king from his pains and to learn from his immense wisdom, saved her life. The king's body was now a prison of agony, his ulcerated leg a well of pus and constant pain, his monstrous weight a cage that prevented him from moving without assistance. The closer he approached his final judgment, the more his world contracted to the fetid chambers where his paranoia reigned supreme, signing death sentences while his counselors, already eyeing little Edward, conspired for the immediate future. The spiral of paranoia was not merely a symptom of his madness. It was the ultimate logic of the power he himself had created. A throne built on fear, which in the end could offer him nothing but the most absolute solitude and the expectant silence of those eagerly awaiting his final breath. It was a spectacle of horror and pity unfolding before the eager and fearful eyes of the court. A transformation as gradual as it was relentless, seeming to be the visible materialization of divine guilt, the slow but inexorable transmutation of a demigod king into his own carnal opposite, a lesson in anatomy on the dangers of hubris. The monster in the mirror did not appear overnight. It was built layer upon layer of suffering and excess, a palimpsest of pain where the image of the Golden Prince became unrecognizable, buried beneath the misshapen mass of a body that rebelled against its own owner. The starting point of this physical decline, beyond the natural ravages of time, lay in that accursed 1536 tournament, when the richly caparisoned horse collapsed upon the royal leg with a thud that echoed not only across the jousting field, but throughout the kingdom's destiny. The wound on his leg, initially treated with the finest ointments and prayers of the court physicians, refused to heal, transforming into an ulcerous fistula, a foul, suppurating portal to the outside world that never closed. This ulcer, which modern doctors suspect may have been varicose or the result of osteomyelitis, became the epicenter of his agony, a constant source of excruciating pain that poisoned his mood and restricted his movements, progressively chaining him to immobility. With reduced mobility, the once athletic monarch, whose muscles had drawn the bow and mastered the sword, began to indulge in the pleasures of the table with a voracity that was both a comfort and a symptom of despair. His diet, always lavish, became an orgy of red meats, game, heavy breads, and oceans of wine and strong ale. Foods that, combined with what is suspected to have been Cushing syndrome or type 2 diabetes, precipitated morbid obesity of legendary proportions. His weight, once distributed across a towering frame over 6 feet tall, accumulated monstrously, especially in the abdomen, creating a silhouette that defied the very nature of royalty. His features, once delicate and commanding, widened and swelled. His small, piercing eyes sank into a sea of flesh, and his famous red hair thinned. Even short movements within his chambers required complex mechanical devices, pulleys, specially designed chairs, and even a primitive crane, to lift and transport him like a great inert burden. A sad spectacle of humiliation before courtiers who recoiled not only out of respect, but to escape the nauseating stench emanating from his open wound, a sweet and putrid miasma that permeated clothing, tapestries, and the very soul of the court. This bodily prison was the perfect ferment for mental deterioration. Chronic pain is a scourge of reason, and Henry, deprived of sleep by the torment of his leg and the difficulty of breathing under the weight on his chest, became a volcano of contradictory impulses. The traumatic brain injury from the jousting accident exacerbated an always latent tendency toward impulsivity and anger, transforming it into virulent paranoia. The man who once debated theology with Erasmus now saw conspiracies in every shadow, treachery in every whisper. His mind, once a beacon of humanism, became a torture chamber where suspicions were magnified by his own physical impotence. Every groan of his leg seemed to whisper that the world despised him in his weakness, that the young and healthy, such as his favorite courtier, Sir William Compton, or the young Catherine Howard, laughed at him behind his back. His religious devotion, always intense, became obsessive and legalistic, a desperate quest for divine absolution for his sins of adultery, murder, and schism, even as he signed death sentences with a bureaucratic coldness that terrified even his most hardened counselors. The execution of the elderly and infirm Earl of Surrey on a trivial heraldic accusation was the final act of a tyrant who no longer distinguished between real threat and the caprice of his own suffering. The monster in the mirror, therefore, was not merely the image of his decrepit body. It was the reflection of a soul deformed by pain, absolute power, and fear of eternal damnation. A king who, in attempting to crush all threats around him, became the greatest monster of all, trapped in the flesh and blood prison he had forged through every excess and act of violence. A solemn warning that not even a king can escape the tyranny of his own body. It was the twilight of the Titan, an autumn that felt more like a long and painful winter of the soul, where the final act of Henry VIII's reign unfolded not on battlefields or in grand ballrooms, but in the fetid, semi-dark chambers of his palaces, where the air hung heavy with the sweet stench of corrupted flesh and the silent fear of the courtiers. The body that had once been the temple of a Greek god, admired throughout Christendom for its strength and proportion, had become a prison of decaying flesh and untold suffering. The varicose ulcer on his leg, a curse that had plagued him for years, had deepened to the bone, becoming an inexhaustible source of pus and agony. An open wound that mirrored the moral decay gradually consuming his spirit. His monstrous weight exceeded all ordinary measures, trapping him in a cocoon of fat and edema that made it impossible for him to rise without the aid of mechanical contraptions and the strongest court servants, men whose sole task was to move the mountain of royal flesh between bed and chair, between the solitude of his chamber and the pretense of the throne. Pain was his constant companion, an inner tormentor that sharpened his already irascible temperament to the brink of sanity, transforming the slightest displeasure into a storm of paranoid rage. The court, once a scene of Renaissance splendor, had become a den of whispers and conspiracies, where men like the Duke of Norfolk and the Seymour family moved like shadows, less concerned with the dying king than with the regency of his fragile heir, young Prince Edward. A piece on the chessboard of power that everyone sought to control. Even Henry himself, in his intermittent lucidity, perceived this game, and that awareness fueled his distrust to the extreme, leading him to sign execution orders with a trembling hand, eliminating not only potential rivals, but even former servants whose loyalty he could no longer discern through the veil of his own suspicion. His final days were a state secret, closely guarded, for the death of a lion is always a perilous moment for the kingdom. Foreign ambassadors wrote speculative reports, based on bribed servants' rumors, describing a monster of biblical proportions, whose breath was foul and whose voice, once resonant, had been reduced to a hoarse, unintelligible roar. The desperate attempts of the court physicians, with their bloodletting, purges, and potions made from exotic and harmful ingredients, only hastened the decline, eroding what little remained of his vital strength. He, who defied the Pope and dissolved monasteries, who declared himself supreme head of the Church, now writhed in bed, perhaps tormented by visions of hell or the ghosts of his 6 wives, 2 of whom he had ordered beheaded. His faith, always a strange mixture of theological orthodoxy and personal arrogance, must have abandoned him in those long nights of insomnia and pain, leaving only the chill of mortality. The final irony, his last and most calculated move on the chessboard, was his will, in a posthumous act of pragmatism that surprised many. The tyrant who had so desired a male heir restored his 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, to the line of succession after young Edward. This gesture, which seemed a belated reconciliation, was in truth the last breath of the statesman. The recognition that the survival of the Tudor dynasty, the work of his life, depended on not excluding his own daughters, no matter how their mothers had fallen into disgrace. It was the legacy of blood that ensured the continuity of blood itself. His death, on January 28, 1547, was kept secret for 3 days to allow the Seymours to consolidate power, and when it was finally announced, a wave of silent relief swept the country, mingled with fear of the unknown. His body, so immense that it had to be encased in lead and dragged by horses to its tomb in St. George's Chapel, left behind a transformed nation, a Protestant kingdom forged in the fire of his desires and personal horrors, a legacy of blood and glory that none of his successors could ever match, but which all would be forced to confront. The Titan would die, but the shadow he cast over England was so long it darkened centuries. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we arrive at the end of this dark journey through the mortal chambers of one of the most formidable and terrifying monarchs history has ever known. The terrifying final days of Henry VIII were not merely the decline of a man, but the bloody twilight of a titan who dragged an entire kingdom into his own agony. From that once golden body, only a prison of rotting flesh and unbearable pain remained. From that Renaissance spirit, only a paranoia that condemned with the wave of a hand endured. His death, a secret tightly guarded, freed England from a reign of terror. Yet the legacy of blood, power, and religious reform he forged with fire and iron forever altered the nation's destiny. If this intimate glimpse of absolute power and its horrors captured you, if you felt the weight of those velvet-draped corridors of Tudor authority, then I earnestly ask, let your finger be swift to hit the like button and your hand to click subscribe. Every like is a vital signal to YouTube's algorithm, showing that you value this deep dive into history, and every subscription ensures you won't miss the next chapter of these royal chronicles. I want to hear your voice in the comments. Which moment shocked you the most? Do you judge Henry as a monster or as a product of his time? Share your reflections, for it is in debate that history comes alive. And now, before we part, allow me one final piece of advice. The screen now presents a new suggestion, a video that promises to be even more visceral and captivating than this one. If the secrets of a king on his deathbed fascinated you, wait until you uncover the story that follows. It is a tale of ambition, betrayal, and an even more dangerous legacy. Trust me, this next video is, without a doubt, more compelling and will fully capture your attention. Do not hesitate, click, and let yourself be carried away on another unforgettable journey. Until next time, and may history continue to astonish you.